According to the Cambridge Dictionary, false flag operations are political or military actions that are made to appear to have been carried out by a group that is not actually responsible. In the year 1962, some of the most powerful figures in government devised a plan to launch a series of false flag operations in order to justify military action in Cuba. And this is the story of it. The year is 1953, and the world's two global superpowers, the United States and the USSR, are embroiled in a Cold War. And just off America's coast, on the island of Cuba, a revolution is coming. See, at this time, Cuba was ruled by a dictator called Fulgencio Batista. Batista had close ties with the US, and under his rule, American industries such as the tobacco and sugar industries made a ton of money at the expense of the poor Cuban population, and an ever-growing divide grew within Cuba. Wealthy foreign, mainly American landowners owned 70% of Cuba's arable land, while so many Cubans had no electricity and minimal access to any healthcare. And so in an attempt to overthrow Batista, a young revolutionary by the name of Fidel Castro, along with his brother Raul, began to stockpile weapons and organize a secret opposition to Batista. And on July 26, 1953, in an attempt to overthrow the dictator, Castro's movement launched an attack on the Moncada barracks, and it was a massive failure. Castro and his companions were severely outnumbered and outgunned, and most of them were either killed or then imprisoned and subsequently tortured by Batista's forces. And for Fidel's role in this failed coup, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But Castro only ended up spending 2 of those years behind bars, because 2 years later, in an attempt to clean up his image as an illegitimate dictator, Batista went on to free Castro and all of his associates, partially because he no longer deemed them as a legitimate threat. But this was a mistake. At this time, Castro's movement took on the name the 26th of July Movement, or M267, in commemoration of the original failed coup attempt. After being released, Castro along with his brother fled to Mexico in order to restructure and regroup with the original members of his movement and finish off what they started. Castro later returned back to Cuba from Mexico, but on December 2nd of 1956, Castro and his accomplices were caught in an ambush, where the majority of his companions were killed or captured. Fidel and his brother managed to survive this encounter, and they had to flee into the mountainous wilderness of Cuba. Whilst in those mountains, Castro built support networks amongst the locals, who had the advantage of having a deeper knowledge of the mountainous terrain. He recruited and trained more fighters for his cause amongst the poor locals, and he used radio broadcasts to spread his message to the Cuban people, all whilst constantly being engaged in brutal guerrilla warfare with Batista's forces. Castro spent 2 years in those mountains, and during those 2 years Castro grew to become a symbol of resistance for many Cubans, but his accomplished Che Guevara would later describe those times in the mountains as the most painful days of the war. Luckily though for Castro, Batista gave up without much of a fight, because on New Year's Eve of 1958, Batista fled the country to the Dominican Republic with his closest allies. Immediately after the news arrived that Batista had fled, Castro set out for the capital, Havana, and within a week, Castro arrived in the capital to a hero's welcome. And just like that, Castro had done it. 6 years after his first failed coup attempt, and 2 coup attempts later, he had successfully overthrown Cuba's Western-friendly dictator. And with that came a lot of changes. Now, remember, under Batista's rule, American industries, especially the sugar industry, were making a ton of money from Cuba. And immediately once in power, Castro began the process of nationalizing all American assets. He passed a series of laws that nationalized all foreign property within the country. One of these laws was the Agrarian Reform Law, which aimed to take land away from large companies and conglomerates and redistribute it to peasants and small farmers. He passed laws nationalizing housing, industry, and banking, and in retaliation for all this, the US decided to stop buying Cuban sugar, which only backfired because the Soviet Union swooped in and started buying it instead. And any time Castro would talk, he would always deliver a provocative tirade against the US.
¿Cuál era la alternativa del gobierno revolucionario? Traicionar al pueblo. Desde luego que para el señor presidente de los Estados Unidos y las industrias más importantes en todos los órdenes eran propiedades de compañías.
And worse yet, Castro started allying with the Soviet Union. That's right, the same Soviet Union the US was in a Cold War with, and a nation just off the coast of the US had just successfully held a communist revolution and was now a Soviet ally. As you can imagine, this really upset the US, and something had to be done about Cuba. President Eisenhower started discussing anti-Castro plans towards the end of 1959. He hoped to develop plans that would make Castro's downfall seem more plausible. He wanted it to seem as if Castro's downfall was a result of his own mistakes, and so Eisenhower ended up signing off on this document, a program of covert action against the Castro regime. But let's just call it the program for short. The program was Eisenhower's plan for overthrowing Castro. It involved 4 main phases, with the 4th phase being the most interesting and relevant to this story. Phase A involved creating an organic-looking political opposition to Castro within the country. The opposition could be made to look like a council or junta, while secretly providing cover for CIA operations. Phase B involved propaganda. In order to spread the message of this opposition, there needed a way to mass communicate to the public, and so plans were drawn up to create a radio broadcasting facility on a little island just off the coast of Cuba called Swan Island, a place where Castro had no jurisdiction to shut it down. Phase C of this plan involved creating a secret intelligence agency within Cuba that would provide the CIA with valuable hard intelligence. And last, but not least, Phase D of this plan was the creation and training of a paramilitary force that successfully hid its CIA origin. This force would hopefully have the ability to lead an armed insurrection against Castro, and for this part Eisenhower began the training of Cuban exiles in Guatemala in order to achieve this. These exiles held a grudge against Castro for destroying their businesses and forcing them to flee Cuba, and to that end, they were willing to take up arms against him. Eisenhower waited patiently for any justification to launch his plan, but unfortunately none did, and he was nearing the end of his presidency, and he never got to fulfill any of those plans to overthrow Castro, but his successor vowed to.
The administration of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy begins.
John F. Kennedy was Eisenhower's successor, and as part of his campaign he promised to clamp down on the threat of communism, and especially on Cuba. Kennedy's campaign focused on a perceived weakness with how Eisenhower dealt with Cuba.
Because the power and prestige of the United States relative to that of the communist world has diminished in the last decade. Whether the future belongs to the Castros and the Khrushchevs and the neutralists who are turning to hostility, they wonder whether the future belongs to freedom.
And once Kennedy was in power, he did things a little differently. Instead of waiting on an excuse to avail itself before launching an invasion, Kennedy planned on launching a full-scale invasion with the exiles that Eisenhower had trained. While all this planning was going on for this, Cuban officials had knowledge of the training of their exiles within Guatemala. But Kennedy still decided to maintain the secrecy of all this, and remained firm in insisting that the US had no intention of meddling with Cuban affairs. Finally, on the 17th of April 1961, less than 4 months after being sworn in, 1,400 Cuban exiles touched down on the southern shore of Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Castro. And right off the bat, it was clear that it was a complete and utter disaster. Castro had prior knowledge of these attacks, and 2 days before, the US failed to destroy Cuba's tiny air force before Castro moved his planes out of harm's way, again because of his prior knowledge. Coral reefs sank some of the exiles' ships as they pulled into the shore. Paratroopers landed in the wrong place, and the element of surprise was missing from this attack, as again, Castro had prior knowledge. Worse yet, Kennedy decided not to provide any air support as he still decided to act as if the US wasn't behind this, despite how obvious it was that they were. And before long, Castro and his forces had pinned the failed invaders on the beach. This event became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was one of the biggest American failures of the 20th century. 114 of the exiles were killed, and the remaining were captured, with several being executed or sentenced to death. The Bay of Pigs disaster dealt a huge blow to the Kennedy administration, and after Bay of Pigs, Kennedy signed 3 national security memorandums that removed the CIA's ability to carry out secret operations in order to gut the CIA. He viewed the poor planning of Bay of Pigs as largely the CIA's fault, since they were largely in charge of training the exiles and carrying out the invasion. Kennedy sought to give power away from the CIA and put it into the hands of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or JCS for short, who he deemed more trustworthy and transparent than the CIA. The JCS are a group of the highest-ranking military officers in the country, and at the time the group was headed by a guy named General Lyman Lemnitzer. Kennedy resented the fact that he went behind the country's back, and he quickly switched his tune on government secrecy. He felt that the government no longer had the right to go behind Americans' backs and meddle in other countries.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
But despite all this, the Cold War was only getting more hostile, and something still had to be done about Castro. Both Kennedy and the JCS both knew that after the Bay of Pigs disaster, they'd need a genuine excuse in order to justify military action. And ironically, while Kennedy believed in more government transparency, Lemnitzer and the JCS decided to be more proactive with the Cuba problem, and in doing so constantly went behind Kennedy's back and went down the exact same route as the CIA earlier. They spawned a frenzy of ways to sabotage or entirely get rid of Castro, and there were no shortage of craziness in some of these plans. For example, exploding cigars in order to kill Castro, spiking Castro with LSD in order to sabotage his speeches, applying thallium salts to his shoes to cause his beard to fall out, or in my opinion, the funniest, nicknamed Operation Bingo, was a plan to trick the US base at Guantanamo to think that they were being invaded by tricking them into think the sounds of hissing snakes were an active firefight, with news of it being sent to Kennedy as justification to launch aircraft at Cuban airfields. I'm not kidding, all of these were genuine plans concocted by the JCS. But as well as some of those crazy sabotage plans, were some plans that were a lot more serious, and were being considered a lot more seriously than trying to make Castro's beard fall out. And one of the more extreme and seriously considered plans was Operation Northwoods. Remember, after Bay of Pigs, the government can simply stroll into Cuba and take over, as they would with any other country. The reason being that they had already tried that, and it failed miserably, and they betrayed the trust of the American public. So while the government was waiting for a genuine reason to convince the American public to want a war with Cuba, Operation Northwoods was a plan by the JCS to expedite that process. The plan involved staging terrorist attacks in order to blame Cuba as an excuse to justify going to war. The plans that were drawn up were equally as extreme as they were horrifying, with plans for attacks on both military and civilian targets, and it's terrifying to think about how close these plans actually came to fruition. At this point, Lemnitzer and the JCS had grown completely tired of Kennedy's perceived weakness in dealing with Cuba, and they were fully committed to going behind his back. The plans for Northwoods included a plan to stage a fake hijacking of a civilian aircraft, where an aircraft filled with government officials in disguise would be diverted from its original flight path, landed safely, while an empty unmanned aircraft painted identically would be destroyed in order to fake an aircraft attack. There were plans to sabotage the US base in Guantanamo by blowing up ammunition, burning the aircraft and lobbing mortar shells, sinking ships, and conducting fake funerals for mock victims, all for public spectacle. Northwoods included a plan to launch a Cuban terror campaign in Miami and other cities, including Washington, against Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. There was a plan to sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida. Plans were drawn up to attempt assassinations on Cuban refugees within the United States, and plans to make it seem like a Cuban fighter jet destroyed a US Air Force plane over international waters. And these were just some of the plans included in this horrifying document. I'll leave a link in the description of this video, a copy of the declassified operation for you to skim through and see for yourself what Lemnitzer and the JCS were up to at this time, because it's a lot. The JCS had unanimously signed off on this plan, and all that was left to do was for Kennedy to sign off on it too. But when this was all brought up to Kennedy, it horrified him, with Kennedy outright rejecting the plan, and now informing Lemnitzer in no uncertain terms that the US would not go to war with Cuba. But Lemnitzer was stubborn, and kept on submitting variations of the plan to get approved, which led to a complete breakdown of trust between Kennedy and the JCS. The same committee brought in to replace the CIA had arguably grown worse than the CIA in terms of secrecy and government scheming. Kennedy later fired Lemnitzer because of this distrust. And Lemnitzer's first order of business after his sack was to destroy his notes, especially those on Operation Northwoods, so he could lie to Congress and claim he had no knowledge of those plans. Operation Northwoods only became declassified and publicly known of 36 years later, after a broader effort to declassify and review Kennedy's records in order to investigate his assassination. This whole story is a cautionary tale of what can happen when too few people wield too much power with too little oversight. And honestly, I don't get much relief in the fact that this plan didn't end up happening, given that the whole scheme was only one man away from it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you'll get exclusive early access to all of our videos a week before they drop. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and liking this video in order to boost our videos with the algorithm. And as always, thank you for watching.